So here's an opportunity then for you to do a little bit of grit and just check your work. So if you've got a red pen, you can tick the ideas that you've got that are similar to mine. You might have some of your own ideas, and as long as you can see it in there and you think it's a valid response, then that'll be absolutely fine. But some of the ideas you can see I've got there is there were lots of damage to buildings. That's what I can learn about the Blitz. I can clearly see that. There's bricks everywhere and I can see smashed in buildings. People seem to be going on about their lives. I can learn that about the impact of the Blitz. I can see people pushing people in prams or their babies in prams. I can see people on bikes, people casually walking, maybe to work. There seems to have been fires caused by the Blitz. There's a huge amount of smoke there on the left-hand side. Homes and buildings probably lost. Again, that's a bit of an inference, but if we're seeing that level of buildings there, we can, certainly suggest or infer that some of those were homes, and also likely that people were killed there. If we see that level of destruction. So we can learn a lot about the Blitz from this one picture. And again, you might have some other ideas. The extension, how useful is this source? Well, you've got there in the green box, the nature, it's a photo. So it clearly shows the damage. Try and avoid being cynical and saying, oh, it's probably doctored or it might be faked. You won't be shown a fake image at all in this course. So it's a photo. It shows the extent of the damage. It's not posed or anything like that. People are just casually going around their day. So it's a photo. We see the extent of the damage. The origin, well, it is from the time. It's taken after a bombing raid. We can still see the smoke coming from that building on the left. So it shows the extent of the damage. There is still fire. The purpose, it could be a propaganda photo. It only shows, however, one small area of bombing. So it doesn't show us the impact of bombing across the whole of London on one evening or one night, because it's only this small street. So it is limited in that use. It's not useless because it still shows the impact of bombing, but it is limited because it is only in that one street. Also, if it is propaganda, it's not going to show huge amount of dead bodies because it's trying to show the positive spin that people are still going about their lives, and that doesn't make it useless. It's just making us aware that a carefully selected image is been chosen here. Yeah, propaganda, it's still to show people are still going about their lives. So a really useful source, but perhaps limited because it doesn't show us the extent of damage on one night across the whole of London. And it gives us an idea about the impact of the Blitz and what it did to London. It destroyed houses, it's destroyed buildings, and disrupted everyday life. Yet people were still willing to carry on regardless and get to work, which is obviously very familiar to what's happening currently. Okay, so check that thinking that you've done. You can obviously rewind any of that ideas that I've said, and then move on to the next slide. So this slide here is just to highlight the types of sources that you will be presented with, which can be used as evidence for an inquiry. You can print this out if you have the means to. You might want to copy these ideas down if you'd like to, but I will keep coming back to these ideas as well throughout the series of lessons. So on that left column here, you can see the types of evidence, some of the types of evidence that you'll be presented with. Photographs I've shown you. Why they're useful, we can see that. It shows clear detail, it shows the impact, we can see the actual visual impact of ideas. Limited, as we've explored already, it only shows one area. It doesn't show a wide range of areas, certainly one photo. You might get presented with a diary entry. Excellent personal account. It gives feelings. So really good to see how people feel about things. Diaries are private generally, so it's going to be a lot more honest about their account. Limited, it is only one person's view. One person might be terrified, another person might be excited. So that's something to think about. Newspaper article, very detailed. They want to tell the story, lots of evidence. Sometimes, though, the language might be quite emotive in a newspaper. They might want people to feel angry. They might want people to feel sad. So just be careful of the language that's used. But still a really useful account because they want to get there. They want to get that story. Official records are a really useful source because they are often very factual. If it's a fire service recording the amount of bombings or the amount of fires, it's not there to give how sad the event was. It's there purely to record the events. So they're really useful, trustworthy sources. We don't know how people feel in them, but we can certainly gives us an idea of numbers and the extent and stats, which is really useful. Mass observation. This was something that was set up in 1937 when it seemed that war was looming, and it's an organization that started to collect photos and diary entries, official records of a wide range of people across London to record life in London during the build-up and potential World War II. Now, I have put a link here purely because hopefully this will. There's a link there, which is happening even today. During the COVID crisis, there is a big drive to collect people's photos and images and accounts and stories of how their lives have been affected by COVID. So it's really interesting. It's not purely just a historical thing. It's something that's still used even today. So you'll see a wide range of evidence from something known as mass observation. More on that later. Also, you get official statements from either from the Prime Minister himself, or it might be official statements within the government. Now, these are also very useful sources because they are written from a position of power. They are private documents. They're not meant for the public to see, so they can be a little bit more honest with what's happening. Try and avoid being cynical about what politicians might say or what they might report and what your beliefs might be. Official statements, official documents like that in the government are very useful, very telling, because they can be a lot more honest. Limited if it's a public statement and it's a politician speaking to the public, then we need to be a bit more careful because the language is going to be generally more positive or toned down a little bit because it's going to be what people want to hear. So there are the examples of the types of sources that you might see. And even today, this isn't something just for History GCSE. This is something in your everyday life when looking or watching the news or reading newspaper or certainly on the internet. Think about what types of sources you're looking at. How useful is it? What is it telling you? What might it not be telling you? So if you can print those out, print that out, have a little look, get that stuck in, or if you want to copy those down, do that before moving on. So, why was London a target in World War II? If you could write that down as a subheading. I've also given you these images, and it'd be useful if you again can print these images off to put them in as a visual clue to think about why London was a target in World War II. So first of all, it is a centre of government. I've got there a picture of the Houses of Parliament, and you can see there St Stephen's Tower, or Elizabeth Tower, I think it might be called now, which houses Big Ben, and this is the Houses of Parliament. So if you can target and destroy the seat of government in a country, then that is going to very much affect morale, the mood of the country, and it's going to make it easier to take over that country because there'll be nobody around to organise the war effort against the Germans. So London is the centre of government, massive target for the Germans. Secondly, it was Britain's most important port. A port is an area where a ship comes in bringing supplies in from other parts of the world. Now I've tried to show here, hopefully you can see the mouse. This is the Thames. It's a very famous photo of the Nazis bombing London. This is the Thames. It was the biggest port in Britain, and the Thames and the ports along the Thames brought in, or the docks, sorry, on the Thames, saw the import of goods from all over the world, which was absolutely crucial to the war effort. So it's important for the Germans to target the port of London, because if they could disrupt that supply coming into the country, then it's going to also affect our war effort and our ability to produce goods for the war. So it's a very important port, and the docklands, which is the area where all these goods came in the East End of London. Thirdly, it was a major industrial centre, producing important supplies for the war effort. So not only was it a port where goods came in, there was also a large number of factories producing everything that might be crucial for the war effort, whether it's matches, uniform, guns, ammunition, switches, other bigger weapons, vehicles. A lot of it was happening in the East End of London. And so if the Germans could destroy that industrial centre, then that would affect our war effort, and again would make it easier for Germany to ultimately beat Britain in World War II. And fourthly, London was Britain's biggest city, population of 8.6 million. That's a huge amount of people. If you could destroy those, then and kill those people, then they would feel very, very sad. Their morale would drop, and they're more likely to surrender. Most of these people in London lived in the East End of London, and I've got there this image of these tenement blocks that many of them lived in, very crowded buildings with many families squished onto them. I'll also show a geographical reason. The geographical reason, it was London is close to France and Belgium, where a lot of German Air Force bases were. So it's also convenient. It was the closest city to France and Belgium and made it within striking distance. So you need to understand those reasons why London was a target. So make sure you've got those reasons down, and ideally with those images there as well to help you. What was the situation at the beginning of 1939? So that's the subheading that I'd like you to write down. This is a little bit of learning, bit of thinking, just to understand what Britain was doing and what London was doing really before war broke out in 1939. I've already mentioned that tensions were rising before 1939 between Germany and Britain. So it really seemed like war was imminent. And so precautions were already being taken way before September 1939. So it's important that you understand that that precautions were being taken. Again, I've given you these 4 images, and all I'm going to ask you to do is cut these images out if you can, if you've got access to them, and then look at the task there. I've given you 4 simple sentences, and it's just a case of matching the sentence with the image, just so you've got a caption for each one. I'll give you a little bit more detail about each of those ideas. We've got number 1 is blackout preparations. Most of you, I think, are probably familiar with blackouts from work you did even in primary school, which is this whole idea where Londoners had to turn off all their lights. These bombing raids were happening predominantly at night time. So by turning out all their lights and street lights, it made it a lot more difficult for German pilots to find their way to London and be able to pick out targets and understand what was happening. So to deal with that, cars had to drive around with no headlights on. So a lot of trees and street corners and pavements were painted with white paint, so people could at least see their way around a little bit at night time, even though I think road deaths actually doubled during that time. We also see air raid precaution or ARP wardens being recruited. And these were volunteers used to patrol streets in case of a bombing attack. They would put out fires, they would help people, direct them to shelters, just generally volunteers that would help out in any war effort. ARP wardens. They'd walk around, you'll see images with them with either ARP on their helmets or W on their helmets as well. There was the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, another voluntary service created to provide various jobs, running canteens, ARP wardens, helping with evacuating children, which was set up for women and by women. And there's also the London County Council. Now, London is a large city area, and to help deal with London and help with any issues and emergencies, it was broken down into 28 boroughs. And one of these pictures here shows the 28 boroughs, and each would have its own powers to coordinate fire services or first aid or to deal with homeless people within their borough. So, for example, St Pancras is a borough. You might see in some of this evidence a name of a borough or a town. It will probably let you know which each one is. So stick them in and just label which each of those is. If you pause it now, and then I will give you the answer, and you can just double check that. So hopefully you've just paused me there, and you haven't just waited. It's fairly obvious. We've got the blackout precautions there, number one. The propaganda poster showing that air raid wardens were wanted. We've got the Women's Royal Voluntary Service. There's just a group of women there. It looks like they're outside a canteen or a hut serving food. And we've got this picture here of a map of London showing it split into some of the boroughs that they've got. And I would always encourage, if you've got the opportunity, to search the internet for more images. There are loads. Certainly for blackout, always they're the most interesting ones to see the type of things that Londoners did to deal with a blackout. So these are just those pictures in a bit more detail. You can see their trees are painted with white lines around it. You'd quite often see curbs as well were painted. The propaganda poster of the air raid wardens wanted, and the women posing there by a hut, looks like probably serving tea for some soldiers or something like that. And this figure from the book, and also it just highlights a nice bit of geography of the extent of or the how close London is. Here's London, and how close it is to Belgium and France, where there are a lot of bases for the Germans, so they could fly into London and bomb London. And here you've got these boroughs. You can just see some of these lines of some of these boroughs. Here is the East End, here the London Docklands, all in this pink colour as well. So you can see the extent, the size of this East End, which is such an important target for Germany. So get those stuck in, make sure you understand those ideas before moving on. So there are three features of London's preparations that I want to get across. And the first one is Operation Pied Piper. So you're going to need to make sure you've got that down as a subheading. What were the features of government attempts to protect civilians? The first one is Operation Pied Piper. Now, the context, the start of the war of 1939, the government launched Operation Pied Piper, which is the code name for the evacuation of women and children out of London to the countryside, where it's thought they would be safer from potential bombing raids on London. Remember, they thought the bomber would always get through, and pretty much straight away they started this evacuation process to get people out of London and into the countryside. The Germans didn't need to bomb the countryside so much. There wasn't a centre of government. There was no heavy industry there. So by moving the people out, or the children out, they would hopefully be at less risk. And then obviously the longer term view of that is if the children survive, then they get to grow up and they can be soldiers and carry on the fight if they need to. So this is the first bit where you're going to use sources to think about the features of government attempts to protect civilians through Operation Pied Piper. Again, I've given you these 4 images. If you haven't got them, or if you're unable to print them out, on the following slides there are bigger versions of them so you can see them more clearly on whatever device you're using. Hopefully the video of my Nan will work as well. But you're going to have that subheading down, and I just want you to look at each image just as you did with the starter and think about the feature. What can we learn about Operation Pied Piper from each of these pieces of evidence? You can either put them by each of the images that I've given you, or maybe just tabulate it underneath all of those images. I will share some answers with you afterwards, but do try this for yourself. Actually engage in that thinking. Really pull apart these pieces of evidence and think about what you can learn from them. So get the title down, cut those images out. Always useful to consider the nature, the origin, and the purpose of each of the sources as well, and just think about how useful it is. I'm not asking you to evaluate. I just want you to take out the content. What can we learn from it at this point? So get the title down, cut those images out if you can. If you haven't, move on to the next slide. So here's some features of Operation Pied Piper. We've got a piece of propaganda, some official information, and a photograph. What can you learn about the features of Operation Pied Piper? And just think about those prompts that I've given you. It might be a case about numbers of people there. How was it organized? Try and get at least 1 or 2 ideas from each source. If you pause it now and you just try and read it through carefully and think about what you can learn from each one. So here's 2 more pieces of evidence here. Here's source A, and do read source A. Actually read it. You will have to in an exam. What can you learn from it? It's I will point out it's a diary here, and it is from an example of it was written for mass observation, so it's part of this wider collection of information where Elaine Potter is writing it to explain her experience. So read it through and think about what you can learn from the Operation Pied Piper. And listen to the personal memory as well. This is actually my Nan recalling her ideas of the evacuation. And it's still an absolutely valid piece of evidence. And avoid falling into the trap of, oh, she's older, she might not be remembering it right. She remembers this much more clearly than she does remember what she did last week. So the memory is don't say that it's a less useful source of personal memory. It's a very, very important piece of evidence. So look at both of these and try and get, again, try and collect about 4 or 5 ideas to show what features of evacuation was like.
So they were completely full of the school houses everywhere, but they're going to have to try and fit us in temporary. So we lined up in the school playground in a semicircle, and they had about 6 or 7 women to come and choose who they would. So they come and look at us up and down and all this around about. And luckily I was one that got chosen, and 2 other girls, which was great because I was the only one, and suddenly I was going to live with 2 sisters anyway. And she cleared the attic out. This woman had cleared the attic out. But the bed, of course, was all broken and, a hole in the middle. And but we had to manage like that. But we didn't care. It was all a laugh, really. had a wonderful 6 weeks there because we couldn't go to school. It was over full. And it was gorgeous weather, as I remember. I lived in this little cottage with a little farm couple and their daughter, and they were nice people, and we used to go out and play on haystacks and go to the river, and we had a wonderful 6 weeks holiday, really. And then eventually the main school sent a teacher down to us because we were just completely alone, and she hired a room from the Women's Institute, and she was going there some mornings, and she'd try and make up a lesson or try and get a rounders game in the afternoon. It was great. Yeah.
Right, time for some grit. Hopefully you've looked at all of those ideas and you've got your own ideas. Here's your opportunity to tick the ideas that you've got right, and feel free to add some of these ideas that I've got down as well. Hopefully you enjoyed my Nan as well, reminiscing about her fun times being evacuated. So if you've put yours as a table, you might have some of these ideas here or similar ideas. Again, be confident. If you think it's pretty much the same idea, then just give it a tick or just correct it a little bit as you see fit, or just use 2 or 3 of these ideas. But clearly that evidence showed that we had to use propaganda to convince parents to evacuate children. It is difficult to get parents to separate from children. So propaganda was used to convince people to evacuate children or to keep them out in the country, because a lot of people were sent out straight away as soon as war broke out in the 1st of September, which you saw in that the official document. But nothing happened for a year. So there was this then desire to bring children back to the cities, and the government had to keep reassuring parents to keep them out in the countryside. Certainly my Nan was pulled back initially. There's a huge disruption to train services to evacuate children. Hopefully you saw that. It is quite a big organisational task to get all of those children onto trains and ship them out across the country. Volunteers were used to help with the evacuation, to make sure it was an available process. Everyone's stepping up to help out in these those times. Evacuation didn't always run smoothly. There were some hiccups, as my Nan said. There was some mishaps and she ended up somewhere else. So it wasn't necessarily always plain sailing, and you're going to see some evidence, well, personal memory, where that is the case, and in some cases it did run quite smoothly. You did see the children wearing labels, they had gas masks, so there is a huge level of organisation. So it was organised, but also there could be mishaps. There's no formal schooling for evacuees. That's something that you might be familiar with at this moment in time. Didn't do my Nan any harm. Hopefully it won't do you lot any harm either. So no formal schooling at all, although they didn't obviously have PowerPoints and online learning at that time. And it required huge organisation. You can see that with the extent of trains, its posters, its propaganda, its volunteers, and it's getting all those children together to get them sent off and match them up with families. So that is evacuation. Hopefully that makes sense, and you've gritted those pieces of work. Once you've done that and you've improved your work a little bit further, we're going to move on to the next slide. So second feature of London's preparations is this idea of gas masks and supplying gas masks. So make sure you've got this subheading down as well. And I've given you those images that you can use to, again, just highlight your thinking a little bit more and highlight the idea of gas masks. The context is that gas masks, or gas was a horror of World War I. Germans used it, and it was feared that they would use it again as a major weapon in World War II. So as early as September 1938, that's a whole year before war was even declared, the government started issuing gas masks for people. They came in adult sizes, children, baby sizes. You can again search the internet and you'll see all the various kinds of gas masks that are available. And people had to go to a fitting station to be given their gas masks. And when war broke out, they're expected to carry their gas masks with them at all times. If they lost their gas mask, I think they would have to pay some money, I can't remember how much, to get a replacement one. And all these boroughs had to buy these gas masks in, or get these gas masks in and assemble them themselves, ready to give out to the people in their local borough. You can see here with this source that the percentage of gas masks, in 1939, when war first broke out, 70% of people were carrying gas masks. Now, by 31st of March 1940, only 1% were carrying gas masks. Now, this was still part of the phony war. No war had broken out yet. And people, obviously, morale or people relaxing, stopped carrying their gas masks a little bit. But certainly, everyone had gas masks to protect themselves. Again, in the world of COVID, it's not anything that's too strange for us at the moment, with people going around with face masks on. This is World War II. Again, watch the evidence, and what features of gas masks can you record? What can you find from the content of the sources?
Great. Yes, I do. That was before we went away. Schools were open at night for people to go up in families, and we ticked off and measured the gas mask put on, and then that's it. So we get a little box, and we had to carry everywhere strapped with this little box.
Okay, and you can grit your responses. Hopefully you've got some down from my Nan and the sources that you were given there. Add, correct, improve the ideas that you've got. Do it in red pen so you can see that you've improved it. So hopefully eventually I can see that you've improved it. Gas masks provided by the government a year before war broke out. There were sizes for adults, children, babies. People had to carry their gas masks everywhere. You'll see it's just such a common sight in all of these images of World War II, of kids with these little cardboard boxes carrying their gas masks inside. They're specially fitted, often at schools in the evening. Source F clearly shows that. My Nan also mentioned that. The threat of gas attacks was large due to German use of gas in World War I, which is why the importance of the gas mask was made. And yet we also see that people began to stop carrying their gas masks as early as March 1940, as there was no active bombing of London. So, correct those responses and then move on to the next idea of London's preparation. Okay, the third subheading. What were the features of government attempts to protect civilians? It was their use of air raid shelters. Again, this is something that probably a lot of you are familiar with from experiences of watching television or learning at Key Stage 2. Again, before the war, British government started to provide people in London with air raid shelters to protect themselves from bombing. These were predominantly the Anderson shelter, the one that most people are familiar with, seeing these little tin shacks that were buried down at the bottom of people's gardens. For those that had gardens, remember there's a lot of people in East End that lived in these big tenement blocks with no garden at all. There weren't enough shelters for the whole of London, and this source E shows that as well. You won't be able to see it right now, but I'll put it on a bigger screen. You'll be able to see that idea. So air raid shelters were provided, and what you'll need to know and understand is the different types of shelters, and just see what you can get from those the evidence that you're going to see. I've given you this image here of an Anderson shelter. I've given you an official document from an ARP service recording how many types of shelters there are. There's this example from the textbook of the different types of shelters, and I'll mention that in a moment, and a contemporary film footage from Pathé News, which was shown at the beginning. People didn't have televisions during World War II. That would be shown in the cinema. People would go to the cinema to watch news, to watch films, and these little clips would be shown before the main film that they'd be showing. So ultimately it's effectively a piece of propaganda. So watch and enjoy all of those, and what can you learn about features of government attempts to protect the civilians in the use of air raid shelters?
When a high explosive bomb falls, any building near is likely to be destroyed, and any house hit is sure to collapse. The rate of supply of Anderson shelters is limited, but every householder can take measures for protection against blast and splinters. He can do the work for himself using scrap materials and earth. From any post office, you can get a booklet, price threepence, which tells you just how to make your home an air raid shelter. To protect a window, fix an old door firmly across the lower half, inside and outside, first removing the glass, and fill the intervening space with earth. An earth barricade about 30 inches thick will protect your front door from blast. Cover the earth with old lino to prevent rain washing it away. A similar earth rampart will protect a basement or area window. The best way to protect a room from glass splinters is to stick curtain netting or old lace curtains on the glass itself. There are ample supplies of netting now available. This will not prevent the glass breaking, but it will stop dangerous splinters flying about. Spread the paste evenly and cut the material so that it overlaps the frame as well as covering the glass. A well-filled bookcase placed before a window gives good protection against blast and bomb splinters. Rig up one room in your house as a refuge room, a small room, and give it all the protection you can. A coal cellar is a good refuge. Make it comfortable, you may have to stay in it a long time. It's up to you to take these precautions, not only to save your own lives, but to ease the work of the Civil Defense Forces. When the raiders pass signal sounds, you'll emerge safely thanks to these simple safeguards which you can make for yourselves. The full instructions are in the booklet. Go to the post office and get a copy today.
What you can see here then in this image is these Anderson shelters that have been delivered by the government. And these two neighbours here, they're digging it in, they're covering it in earth, half submerging it. The whole family here getting involved. Always looks like a dog here in a gas mask. I think that's what that is. Chap here using some tools to strengthen it up. It's quite labour intensive. A lot of people trying to get their Anderson shelter, but also very, very flimsy. What's also interesting is these types of shelters that were produced. You get these trench shelters here and these communal and public surface shelters, and they're built from brick or concrete, often in the middle of streets, so not a million miles away from houses and targets anyway, and people didn't feel safe in them. Just the same as these trench shelters, deep trenches dug in parks with a very gentle roof dug over the top, people not feeling safe in them at all. And if we just look at this source, this official document from an ARP service, these types of sources, the communal surface and the trench shelter here, they have a capacity of 17,000 and 12,000. So collectively, that's 29,000 people. Now, if they don't feel safe in those shelters, then effectively, how well are the government really doing here? What they're going to do? Also, what's interesting to know is 167,000 people in the St Pancras borough, and yet they've only provided shelter for 144,000. So clearly, how well are the government doing? Well, some people might think they're doing a great job. Other people might think they're doing an awful job and they're not providing for absolutely every single person. And that's something that you might recognise with a and the grit for the shelters. These are probably all the ideas that you've got. Anderson shelters provided by the government for those with gardens. Many types of shelter for those without gardens, such as the Morrison shelter or communal shelters. There weren't enough shelters for the population of London. The government also relied on the population to make their own shelters out of their houses. Cracking bit of video that Pathé News, it clearly shows that people are trying to do everything they can to look after themselves. Morrison shelters, smaller houses with strengthened tables. Yeah, just made out of steel, and you'd go under there at night and sleep under those. Pretty terrifying, I should imagine, if your house was bombed. So grit your work, tick it, improve it, red pen all over it. Hopefully you understand there all the features of London's preparation for war. Once you've improved that, you're just going to move on and use those ideas, and I'm going to set you an assignment, bit of thinking using some sources. So what I'd like you to do is, going back to source A and B, I've given you a picture of those. You'll recognise this source question from the Weimar Nazi Germany paper. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the success of Operation Pied Piper? Now, remember to do this. It's a 12-mark question. The main idea is CCP. Comment on content, context, and provenance. The context is all of those tables that you've got, the features of Pied Piper or gas masks and shelters. That's your context. You know that happened, and you can use that information to support or challenge other ideas in the sources. So first of all, comment on source A. Why is it useful about the success of Operation Pied Piper? What can you learn from that source? Quote the source. Support that with your own knowledge to show why that's true. Here you'll be using knowledge from anything I've said or you've recorded, or from other sources. And the provenance, why does that make it useful as well? How does the provenance make it useful? Repeat the process for source B, and you may add a very brief conclusion about perhaps how both together are useful, how it shows you a bigger picture of the success. That'd be wonderful, but you don't necessarily have to. And the key idea is it's a 12-mark question. You'll spend no more than 18 minutes, and that 18 minutes includes reading those sources and also writing that response. So it's not going to be reams and reams of writing, not at all. And go back and look at your Weimar Nazi Germany papers as well if you need to. So enjoy that. Hopefully that made sense. Feel free to rewind and play as much as you need, and please attempt that question. Hope that all made sense. Thank you very much.